In this roundup of the week, climate negotiators in Madrid are fighting over proposals to let countries sell each other permission to pollute more. In another stroke of campaigning genius, Extinction Rebellion glue themselves to an electric bus, while the group faces louder demands to throw out Roger Hallam for his Holocaust remarks. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. The UN climate talks in Madrid began this week, with over 10,000 delegates from around 200 countries. You'll remember they were due to take place in South America, but got moved at the very last moment to Spain. These are relatively technical talks, so the mainstream news has been restrained on any coverage, except, of course, for the fact that 16-year-old Greta Thunberg arrived there safely after her transatlantic boat voyage. But the big point of contention is one that seems a pretty big deal, which is Article 6 of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So when the Paris Agreement deal was done in 2015, there were several important points of detail that hadn't been thrashed out. These things can be complex and difficult to agree. Article 6 wasn't agreed in principle until the very last moments of the Paris negotiations, and it's remained unresolved in detail until this meeting. Depending on who you listen to, Article 6 could help the world avoid dangerous global warming, or it could let countries off the hook from having to make significant changes. So, what is Article 6? It's all to do with using international carbon markets to reduce global emissions. Basically, it's emissions trading. Countries that, for reasons specific to them, are finding it more difficult than most to reduce their emissions in line with their agreed targets could buy emissions reductions from other countries that have been able to overperform on their targets. The theory of such trading is that those who have the most capacity to make deeper cuts do so because they have a financial incentive to go further than their targets. Those that can't go so fast are able to buy that extra capacity. The world achieves its overall target for emissions reductions, but no one's forced to do things that are really impossible for them to do. Those that can cut easiest, cut the most. That's the theory, and in theory, the theory is wonderful. But in practice, well, people are raising serious doubts about whether this would work. Part of the problem, as I discussed in last Friday's video, is that some of the countries have more stringent targets than others. China, for instance, has extremely relaxed targets. So you could see a situation where China is able to exceed those targets because they're not set at an adequate level in the first place, and then a country that could have reached an adequate level, given political will, buys reductions from China so that it doesn't have to perform to an adequate level either. As you can imagine, even if you support the principle for all this, the detail of how it actually gets implemented is of crucial importance. For instance, in principle, the arrangements could enable emissions to be double counted, with reductions made by one country actually being counted towards the reductions for both countries. Avoiding that being able to happen depends on certain complexities in how things are accounted for. Plus, once you have a system like this, you're incentivising every initiative for decarbonisation. But big systems like that can have all sorts of unintended consequences. If country A was going to aim for net zero carbon on the fastest timetable possible, which I still think is 2050 because none of the alternatives floating around the UK general election have actually explained how they'd solve some of the technical barriers to doing it quicker. But whatever it is, supposing it was going to do that, because it sees that it's the right thing to do, suddenly those actions take on a potential monetary value. It could change the whole equation. What we'd want to have happen is they'd set the target of net zero and plough all steam ahead to achieve it in the best possible way, reducing carbon at the same time as protecting livelihoods and quality of life. But with the wrong system, you create an incentive not to do that. You create an incentive to adopt a softer target, not net zero, and then do some of the things you would have done anyway, and then you can sell some of those additional reductions to another country. Money in the bank for doing what you would have done anyway. But of course then you have a country that didn't make the emissions cuts but balanced them against yours. So the overall effect worldwide is to reduce emissions cuts. And the weak spot is the fact that we're dealing with nationally agreed targets that are inadequate to meet the global reductions that we want to make. And how those targets get set is down to international diplomacy. That is a terrible process for getting a system that works. Unless you're going to simply say everyone has to get to net zero by 2050, And if we draw a straight line between here and there, that means whatever it would be, 45% down by 2030. On that journey, you can buy and sell emissions in the short term. But unless we have industrial scale carbon capture by 2050, then everyone needs to be at net zero by that end period. Now, some people suggest that having the trading system will encourage some countries to agree to steeper targets than they're willing to right now. But even so, that net zero for all scenario is not what I nor anyone else is expecting to come out of COP25. Because a lot of countries are simply negotiating for the least pain and not focusing on the long-term goal. There are discussions about whether carbon credits generated under the old Kyoto Protocol could count towards the new system. Credits generated of that period were unused because it was a badly designed system and consequently there was a lack of demand. There could be as many as 4 billion units that would be carried over if that was permitted, weakening the overall targets further. We will find out how it all ends up next week. No doubt there'll be something that a bunch of people will sign. Greta will probably make a speech somewhere, and that's the bit the media will cover, and the stage will be set for the more important meeting in 2020, which is where we find out who is willing to increase their target to what. Always remember, it's not conferences that solve big problems like this, it's action that solves big problems like this. And many of those actions can be taken without a bunch of people in a room coming up with overcomplicated mechanisms. For instance, one of the more hopeful presences of this event were some of the businesses. 285 businesses have signed up to science-based targets in reducing their emissions. According to a new report by the Science Based Targets Initiative, the action by the companies will reduce emissions by 265 metric tonnes of CO2 equivalent, which is equivalent to shutting down 68 coal-fired power stations. The companies have either set the targets based on the 2 degrees C or the 1.5 degrees C more stringent targets. That latter group has grown from just 4 companies 18 months ago to 76 today. This is one of the reasons why I encourage people to pay more attention to the actions that the forward-looking socially responsible businesses are taking. These businesses are all huge worldwide companies with significant emissions in the countries where they operate. They don't have to wait for a UN panel to tell them they're allowed to take action. They can take action quickly. They have to continue to make a profit while they do it. So they work hard at working out what will work and what won't, and they'll test things, and the things that work they'll drive to scale. And once they've innovated and reorganized and demonstrated what can be done, then some of the new things they've established can quickly become industry norms. And why should they do it? Because unlike politics, which is full of competing agendas and ideologies, business at its best is pragmatic. And it can see how it will benefit business if it can create the successful future products and processes that will help us to thrive in a zero carbon world. And it's worth reflecting, by the way, that many environmental campaigners, and certainly the likes of Extinction Rebellion, who decided it would be too counter-revolutionary to even talk to businesses, would think that the presence of those businesses at the Madrid summit must be a dreadful thing. Evil corporations could only be there for one purpose, which is to find ways to water down whatever the radicals most want to see come out of the process. Which probably most sensible people will work to water down because what they suggest is completely unrealistic. But then they'll be able to say, ooh, there you are, nefarious forces. Speaking of environmental campaigners, Extinction Rebellion has been doing its best to make a mark on the British general election again this week. And namely, they decided to dress up as bees and glue themselves to the Liberal Democrats' campaign bus. It was very quickly pointed out to the campaigners that the Lib Dems, who have historically been seen as very green amongst the mainstream parties, had actually gone to the trouble to get an electric campaign bus. That didn't seem to stop them. They berated the Liberal Democrats for setting a net zero target for 2045, and I agree, they should be challenged on that. After all, they haven't explained in their manifesto at all how they can magically get there 5 years quicker than the Committee on Climate Change suggested that they could. So it's just plucking a hopeful figure out of the air, really. But of course, that's not why Extinction Rebellion was protesting. Basically, their view was if you're going to pluck a figure out of the air, it should be their figure, 2025. And even the Green Party, which after all is headed up by Extinction Rebellion spokesman Rupert Reed, the Green Party isn't plucking that figure out of the air, although it's not far off at 2030. I must admit I'm rather befuddled by this action. because not only do you go and glue yourself to an electric vehicle, but you also dressed up as bees. Why bees? I mean, I thought Extinction Rebellion was focused on climate change. Bees are not much affected by climate change as things stand up right now. In fact, if you look at the managed beehives across the world, bees seem to be doing relatively well, having recovered numbers after problems with certain invasive predator mites and wasps. There are some questions about the decline of bees in the wild, but these are significantly less apocalyptic than they were painted some time ago, and the drivers for declines in wild bees are the usual ones, habitat loss being the prime one. So if you're protesting the Liberal Democrats because of their net zero target, why does it make sense to dress up as bees? I'm not seeing the connection. Of course, it wasn't only the Liberal Democrats who were targeted. Here's a picture of people driving their message home to some workers for the Brexit Party. So when Extinction Rebellion say that they adopt the tactics they do because they're following in the footsteps of Gandhi and Martin Luther King, I look at this picture and I'm struggling to see the link. Don't know what you think. Elsewhere, in the midst of the largest strike action seen in Paris for a long time, Extinction Rebellion also made their mark felt there. As commuters in Paris turned to the city's electric scooters to get around a centre brought to a traffic halt, they found that Extinction Rebellion has sabotaged them. Seems they really don't like electric transport. Buses, scooters. XR France claimed responsibility for sabotaging 3,600 scooters because it said that the green image of the vehicles hid an ecological catastrophe. It also said it had sabotaged scooters in Bordeaux and Lyon, so that's at least 3,600 French commuters who will definitely have been converted to caring more about climate change. I mean, seriously, if you were a nefarious oil company that was going to put time into destroying any sympathy for the environmental movement, you couldn't do a better job than this. On the plus side, it's been given a boost to my determination to finally nail my French. My Twitter timeline has been full of a sort of French vocabulary you just don't get taught on Duolingo. Very educational. But this was all really light distraction. Elsewhere, the slow meltdown of Extinction Rebellion over Holocaust Gate continued. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, co-founder Roger Hallam did an interview with 2 German newspapers where he appeared to downplay the Holocaust, in the wake of which XR Germany condemned him and said he was no longer welcome there, and his own XR UK group publicly disassociated itself from his words. As I reported last week, there's some sort of ongoing internal conflict process that XR is conducting in order to try and deal with the situation. But while they're doing that, the temperature is raising and tempers are fraying. This exploded into public view this week with a message from Extinction Rebellion Scotland, which abandoned any awkward nuance and called for Hallam to be expelled. XR Scotland's media and messaging team stands united with those who demand that Roger Hallam leave the Extinction Rebellion movement. Racist, far-right dog whistles and anti-Semitism must not be tolerated in any XR spaces. That's an extraordinary attack, let's be clear. Not just that Hallam was wrong, but that he intended to signal to the far right with an explicitly anti-Semitic act. The fact that not only are people speaking in those terms in private discussions, but a UK XR group is posting that publicly tells you everything you need to know about the bitter struggles going on behind the scenes right now. In an interview on BBC Radio 5 Live, an Extinction Rebellion spokesperson was challenged on what was happening with all of this, and she said that Roger Hallam had been asked to step back from any public statements while the internal process was taking place. A number of the internal critics are describing the process as founders syndrome, likening it to what happens with businesses that start with a charismatic founder who then for various reasons becomes left behind as the organisation grows. But you know, it's not really that. It's a phenomenon of leaderless movements. When you don't have formally constituted and accountable leadership, then what happens is you get informal and unaccountable leadership instead. Rupert Reed is not one of the founders, but he is one of the leaders. Certain voices get amplified, people with charisma find that others look to them to take the lead, and outliers use the lack of structure to impose their minority views. I've seen it all in practice, and XR's got a rather bad case of it right now. The irony is that a lot of them are telling themselves that the Roger Hallam situation is why they shouldn't have leaders, but it's actually the exact opposite. But there you go. The intersectional left is basically taking over Extinction Rebellion. Roger Hallam has as many internal enemies as he does because whilst being an activist of the left himself, he saw the intersectional politics of the left as being a diversion from the single-minded focus he thought would make the movement successful. And he was kind of right about that, as we are seeing and as we will see. But if you're going to position yourself on the left in the first place with the aims that he outlined of overthrowing the regime and all that, then that is the nature of the beast. And although he might have been right in terms of that aspect of campaign strategy, his way of talking about it was clumsy and led to a whole bunch of activists jumping up and down and saying things like XR doesn't care about people of colour and all the various other flavours. It seems entirely possible that the movement will now gradually drag itself down into becoming more and more of an unpleasant cesspool of mutual recrimination, caught in a downward spiral of actual campaign effectiveness. The danger is that in so doing, it will do even more real harm to the cause of taking action on climate change than it has done already, and that in due course, we'll look back with misty-eyed nostalgia to the days when protesters got pulled off the roofs of trains by angry commuters and XR people glued themselves to electric buses and sabotage scooters. All right, that's enough of that. Time for one thing that I like and then one thing that I don't. This week I watched the documentary on Amazon Prime about Andy Murray's long journey back from the hip injury that took him down at his peak through having his hip resurfaced and back into tennis. I'm a huge tennis fan generally, but like many others, always inspired by how the elite players train and learn from defeat and overcome obstacles to achieve the pinnacle of their sport. Murray I find to be a great understated character, maligned and misunderstood by some, but really an inspirational force, someone who's had to overcome multiple setbacks before finally becoming a Grand Slam champion and world number one. This documentary is a remarkably candid look into the background that is normally kept hidden, and I found it absolutely fascinating. And the thing that I don't like, something of a contrast to the example of sports people dedicated to the ability of free competition to inspire you to be the best that you can, we have the Turner Prize. The Turner Prize is an art prize given every year to an artist born or based in Great Britain. Named after the English painter J.M.W. Turner, it's often provoked controversy with some of the unconventional artists whose work has been highlighted. This year, however, they went one step beyond. All four of the artists who were shortlisted decided to form themselves into a collective and demand that they should all win. At a time of political crisis and widespread division, they wanted to make a collective statement in the name of commonality, multiplicity and solidarity in art as in society. And the judges decided to go along with it, so everyone got a prize. That's nice. And here's a picture of them all, posing with a Tories out sign, because they wanted to make a statement against political crisis and division by taking sides in the political divide. Makes perfect sense. Well, I predict one thing from this, whereas previous winners such as Damien Hirst and Tracy Emin, whether you like them or not, established themselves and their reputation on the basis of winning this prize, nobody's going to remember any of these people within a few years' time. As everyone knows from the brilliant film The Incredibles,
and when everyone's super, no one will be.
If you eliminate competition, you have no way to recognise excellence. And in art, as in sport, as in most other fields in life, including campaign strategy, excellence makes a difference, and it's what we want to celebrate. That's it for this week. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.